Here we go. Welcome. Good morning, everybody. My name's John. I'm here from Therapy Gardens, and you guys know Therapy Gardens apparently from Dave Wheeler, right? You've had a few. Which workshops have you done with Dave? What has Dave come to talk about with you? Garden?
A couple of women use soups.
Okay.
I don't remember what else he did.
Marijuana.
Marijuana.
He did.
How was the marijuana one? Was it worthwhile?
It was interesting.
Interesting?
Yeah,
That's kind of, that. Needless to say, that seems to be getting extremely popular around
Oh,
here.
you think?
I mean, one of the things, let me link marijuana to coffee, what we're coming here to talk about today. So
Drugs.
marijuana is a psychoactive substance, right?
Yeah.
What's the most popular psychoactive substance in the world?
coffee.
It is indeed coffee.
Really?
And when we say it's coffee, what do we really mean? What is it?
Caffeine.
It's caffeine.
No wonder my wife drinks so much of it.
And it-
I can't stand it.
And it is
So,
addictive.
so a psychoactive substance, when I say psychoactive, my daughter asks me, you know, what do you mean? She thinks I mean an active psycho, like Ted Bundy before he was arrested. And I remind her, no, it means anything that affects the mind. And caffeine in particular, the way that it works, there's something called adenosine, which is a neurotransmitter in our brains. And every moment we're awake, it accumulates and makes us more and more tired. But what caffeine does is it blocks those receptors. So caffeine stays there and the adenosine can't accumulate and we get invigorated by it as a result. And so in terms of the caffeine, the best way to measure that, how many cups of coffee do folks drink a day? Does anybody drink more than 3?
Easy.
How many do you drink?
Probably 10.
10.
Wow. I usually 2 to 3.
2 to 3?
2.
2? None?
I go 5 or 6.
5 or 6? Did you ever drink it?
No.
Wow.
But I used to drink 20 to 30 cups a day. And
Okay.
I kind of cut back a little
Oh, wow. Yeah.
I drink it all day long.
So, yeah, in terms of, you would say that I mean, we can talk about the health benefits, and maybe we should already move into that and talk about how it affects the health since we're talking about caffeine. But for folks that like to drink a lot of it, I mean, first of all, in terms of caffeine, if you have a blood pressure issue, that's where the caffeine could end up giving you some problems. So people, I'm going to list these myriad, tons of different benefits that inure to the coffee drinker, but if you have high blood pressure, a lot of caffeine might make you feel pretty uncomfortable and could even be hazardous for you. Yeah.
Thursday, the nurse took my blood pressure, 120 over 70.
Nice. Very nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, it doesn't necessarily,
I had already had a couple cups of coffee before that.
yeah. None of this necessarily applies to one individual, right? It doesn't sound like you have an issue with blood pressure, which is wonderful. That's probably why you're able to drink 10 cups a day.
My wife passed away about 1.5 years ago, but
Oh, sorry about that.
she was so aggravated with me, you know. We'd sit there watching television at night, and I'd have a few cups of coffee. And then we'd watch the 11 o'clock news together, and 11:30 I'd go to bed, okay? And so would she. And I would have a cup of coffee at 11 o'clock while I was watching the news.
Oh, nice.
She says, how can you fall asleep? I said, so I lie down, I fall asleep.
That's wonderful. Yeah.
I may wake up at 3 or 4 o'clock and go to the bathroom or something, but that's about
Who
it.
doesn't?
And then 6:30 like a charm. Almost every morning at 6:30 I wake up.
Nice. I mean, they talk about the different health benefits for coffee and for different things. I had 4 grandparents, and one of my grandparents, my beloved grandmother, my mother's mother, all she did was drink coffee, it seemed to us when we were kids. She always had a cup in her hand, and the other part of her constitution were unfiltered Chesterfield cigarettes. So she'd smoke the Chesterfields and drink the coffee. She was a reformed alcoholic. She stopped drinking around the time I was a little kid, so she was she was probably around 60 when she stopped drinking. And she continued to pump down the coffee and the smokes. And of my 4, and we never really saw her eat anything other than like coffee cookies, or it seemed like that's all she put in her body. I mean,
Coffee cake?
I'm sure she had some other food, but, and among my 4 grandparents, She lived the longest. She lived into her mid-80s. She ended up stopping smoking at some point in her mid-70s, but she drank coffee the whole time.
You talk about reformed alcoholics. My wife's got 19 years sobriety, and we've gone to meetings in the past. And most 99% of people, when they stop drinking, they go right to coffee. That's their substitute.
Right.
You know, and a lot of them are still smoking too.
Yes.
Again, my father drank a lot of coffee, okay? And he grew up in the era of coffee pots, the electric coffee pots.
The drip coffee.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, the percolators?
Oh, the percolator.
And he would go through a whole pot of that stuff
Wow.
before he even ate breakfast.
Oh my God.
Wow.
You know, I used to sit there and watch him, you know.
My grandmother,
But she only lived to be 100, so
we would make a pot of coffee in the percolator.
both of them.
So we should talk a little bit about, since we're talking about the physiology and we're talking about caffeine, we should talk about the other health issues with coffee, the other ways it benefits you, because there are a slew of them. It's kind of amazing. And you've probably heard most of these. There's studies that have shown that it helps with depression. There's studies that show that it helps with your heart. There are studies that it shows that it helps stave off dementia and helps with Alzheimer's. It delays cognitive decline. There are all sorts of studies that show how beneficial it is. Now, when I first walked in, I was speaking with one of you who was telling me about reading some article about how sugar doesn't affect children and how what is your daughter?
My
Who's the
daughter, she's
teacher?
a kindergarten teacher,
She-
and she read it someplace, and she got irate and started looking into the details,
So
how they came up with it.
So it's really hard. It's really hard to pin down a fact these days, needless to say, because the internet and the phone can basically reflect just about anything you want to know. There's always somebody that holds some opinion. So even for stuff that seems scientific, it's hard to pin it down. You see both sides of the argument. Like one coffee example is, starting in 2017, and you can see this on the internet, you see the statement that coffee is the second most popular commodity in the world, the second biggest commodity in the world. And I kept seeing that, and I shared that a few times, and then I drilled down and I looked at that. I looked at different commodities, and you have hard commodities, which are things that are mined, including the biggest commodity in the world, which is bent crude oil, along with gold and things like that. And then you have soft commodities, which are things like wheat and soy and even cattle. And when you look at it, you find out that coffee is nowhere near the second biggest in the world. But as of 2017, that was promoted and people ran with it. So now you can still see it all over the internet, but it's simply not true. So to your point earlier, some of these things need be taken with a grain of salt, but all the evidence suggests that coffee does have a lot of these benefits legitimately.
Just not a grain of sugar.
There are a lot of clinical studies that seem really valid that show all of these different benefits for coffee. Where did coffee come from in the first place? Does anybody know the legend behind the origination of coffee? In Ethiopia, they say there was a goat herder named Coffee, Kaffa or I, and one day his goats started to eat the berries off of the coffee plant. It has red berries, the coffee plant does. And after the goat ate the berries, the goats were really excited. So he tried it, he got the same effect. Local monks did too. And from there, it moved across the Red Sea. And the first real solid history for it is around 1450 or so in Yemen. And they were Sufi monks that actually started making coffee in the same way that we make it now. And those Sufi monks used it in order to stay up for their rituals. And within the next 100 or so years, coffee moved throughout the Arab world. So it moved to Persia, and it moved throughout the Arab world. What's interesting is that during that time period, there were all of these developments in terms of human civilization that were driven by the Arab world. the numbers that we use today, Arabic numerals. They were doing a lot of the complex mathematics that set the stage for today's technology. And you could definitely make the argument that part of the reason for that was the coffee. They were all of a sudden gathering in places and sharing ideas. Does anybody know what in the European world people were starting the day with at that point most commonly? Anybody know what was the beverage before coffee in the Western world?
Wine or wine?
Exactly.
Was it wine?
It was beer or wine or some variation of it. Because in so many places water is impure and also people are interested in another kind of drink. So there is really an interesting argument and a tie between coffee and civilization, that stimulation that comes from it. So after it stayed in the Arab world for around 100 years, then it tried to nose its way into Europe. And it came, people say it came in through Venice and places in Italy. And in the late 1500s, the Catholic Church which needless to say held a lot of power at that time in Europe, was trying to push it out. They said, we don't want any part of this. This is Satan's beverage, they said. And they said it was Satan's beverage because it was primarily an Islamic thing. And they thought that's Islam, this is Christendom. What's that?
I said they weren't prejudiced.
And then Pope Clement, there was a Pope Clement VII, and he said, listen, I'll be the arbiter here, I'll decide. And he came forth, and he was apparently a coffee lover, because he came back and said, you know what, this isn't Satan's brew, this is really good stuff. So he gave it the thumbs up, and after that it started to move throughout the Western world. So he made that proclamation in 1600 on the button. And within 50 years, coffee had moved throughout the Western world. So within 50 years, it was not only in London, but it was in, for example, New Amsterdam. Does anybody know where New Amsterdam is? Yes.
New York.
New York,
I
right.
don't even know what old Amsterdam is.
So, so it had moved to the Americas, and it was now in the United States, what would be the United States, and New Amsterdam. But it was still, as you can imagine, second in popularity to tea. And what was the reason for that?
We were English.
We were colonized by the English. I mean, New Amsterdam was indeed a Dutch colony, but still it was that kind of influence. So tea remained the #1 drink in these parts from that time, 1650, until when?
Boston Tea Party?
Exactly. Until the Boston Tea Party. And the Boston Tea Party, 1773, 3 years before the Revolution, King George decided to put an additional large tax on the tea that we were buying and drinking. And so folks here were like, you know what, the hell with it, and threw the tea off the boat in protest. And so from that day forward, drinking tea was a little unpatriotic, and coffee really moved to the top of the list.
Now, when Dave was talking last time, he mentioned about the tea party, when they threw the tea, he says like thousands of pounds of tea still in the harbor today.
Oh, really? Oh, I didn't know
I
that.
think he mentioned like in the thousands, or maybe in the tons, I don't know. He said that they've never recovered.
Wow, that makes sense.
Check with David on the exact number, I'm not sure.
So that's a little history of how it moved. And now in terms of the popularity, there are 2 billion cups of coffee that are consumed every day, a little over 2 billion cups of coffee. 70% of Americans drink coffee, and most of us make it at home, make a cup at home. There's still about 1/3 of folks who go to coffee shops several times a week and get their coffee that way. Sometimes when I'm driving around and I look at all the Dunkin' Donuts and the Starbucks, I'm confused by that. It seems to me that it seems like at least half the people are getting their coffee by going through the drive-thru or going to a coffee shop. But indeed, that's not the case. It's still more than twice as many make it at home.
In Fall River, we get down there, we get free coffee. He gets a free coffee for us all the time.
Oh,
We get it
nice.
At least once a week there.
Nice.
Yeah.
I never buy coffee at a coffee shop.
Yeah.
Never.
Yeah, make it at home.
Yeah. Much stronger.
I just had a cup of my ex-partner where I just stayed in Situate and visited with my daughter, stayed last night, and she makes coffee every morning. She just makes the best coffee.
Yeah.
It doesn't compare to the other
What
stuff.
kind of coffee does she make, do you know?
I don't even know exactly what she gets but she grinds the beans herself.
Oh, she does, yeah.
She gets the
Right.
beans and then she grinds them herself, and then both she and I like cream in it,
Yeah.
and she knows the exact amount of cream, and she does a pour over. Do you guys know the pour over?
Yeah. That's the way I do it.
The pour over just with hot water, and you have a paper filter. You put the coffee in and you just pour it over. It's really simple, but it's really good. So the coffee plant itself, is one that is usually when it's cultivated is maybe about as big as me, or maybe this big. If you let it grow in the wild, it'll continue to grow. It could get up to 15 to 20 feet. But if you're going to be cultivating the coffee, that's a giant pain in the neck. You want to keep it at probably 6-8 feet in height. And it's primarily equatorial, so almost all of the places that really produce the coffee in quantity are somewhere near the equator. Like, can anybody guess what the biggest company, the biggest exporter
Colombia?
of coffee is? Colombia's number 2, or number 3, I'm sorry. Brazil is number 1.
Okay.
Yeah. And there's a sleeper at number 2. Who do you think is the second biggest?
Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast.
Oh, no, don't. The second biggest is Vietnam,
Wow. That's surprising.
which is surprising. So regionally, where coffee comes from, and it's also grown by, there are an incredible number, as I looked into this, there are an incredible number of small farmer growers, most of whom live in poverty, who grow the coffee. There are farmers all over everywhere, and there's controversy naturally surrounding it. A lot of environmentalists say that the clearing of land is a real issue for coffee production and cultivation. Like in Brazil, for instance, it's fertile, but they'll clear an area of rainforest in order to grow coffee. The optimal conditions for the coffee it's most often grown in shade. It can grow in direct sunlight and still work, but it requires a lot more water and fertilizer if it's in the sun. So ideally it grows in the shade, and it starts to struggle if the temperature goes above 80 degrees. So it's not only grown in the shade, but if it's in really hot climates, it loves the humidity and a slightly lower temperature. So it's usually grown at some elevation in the mountains in those different places. The caveat here for the plant is that all of that's beginning to change with the climate changing, so that you can now start to grow coffee farther and farther north. And there are some really interesting things going on, for example, in Florida. There's a University of Florida effort right now to figure out how we can grow and cultivate our own coffee here in the United States. And they're doing it in concert with citrus groves, because they say that the citrus groves, first of all, it's convenient because the groves are already there and have irrigation systems. So right off the bat, that's a benefit. They also say since it thrives in shade, they can have it sit with the citrus plant and get some shade from the citrus plant. So there are a lot of different efforts to bring it here. There's also the question of indoor cultivation over time. And I don't know if you've heard Dave's workshop on indoor gardening, but just the wonders of technology, they're getting to the point now where if you have the resources, you can grow almost anything inside with the technology. So that there's some promise with that as well. Does anybody have any questions about that, about the distribution of coffee, the plant? No? Okay. In terms of the flavor and the taste, there are 2 different kinds of coffee beans. Does anybody know what those are?
Arabica,
I'm guessing light and dark, I don't know.
Arabica and Robusta. Those are the 2 types. The overwhelmingly popular one is the Arabica one. The Arabica one is about 85%, 80%
Does that
of
come
coffee.
from Arabia? I know you said Arabia was like one of the first.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Not necessarily the way it's distributed.
Okay.
But the Robusta ones are pretty much, I mean, when I mentioned Vietnam, that's where the Robusta coffee is cultivated. One of the places in
Is one of them
Southeast
stronger than
Asia.
the other, by the way?
There's some there. Well, one has, they say that the Robusta might be a little bit stronger.
Okay.
The Robusta might have a slightly higher caffeine content, and to some folks, a
So if
slightly
you
more.
get Starbucks coffee, it could be robust because they have strong coffee.
No,
Compared, okay, that's nothing.
it's all
Okay.
it's all Arabica.
Okay,
Yeah, they don't want to run that risk.
Okay.
Although what they will do sometimes is buy Robusta beans and mix it in
Okay,
with the
yeah.
Arabica, but they don't really admit to that.
okay.
So for the you have the caffeine content slightly higher with the Robusta, and it has that stronger flavor as well. And in terms of the caffeine content of something, does anybody have a sense of, like, if you drink a Coca-Cola, the amount of caffeine that you're getting versus a cup of coffee? Like, how many Coca-Cola cans would you need to drink to get the same caffeine as you do from a cup of coffee? Any guesses?
6.
Yeah, it's around 6.
Now, I would think Coke would have more caffeine than coffee, but it's the other way around.
No, yeah, it doesn't.
That surprised me too.
So, and for the caffeine, you then get into the roasting. So once you have the raw product, the coffee product, and the beans are traded as pre-roasted beans. So they're green and soft, the beans are, before they commoditize them and sell them in general markets. I don't know if you've ever seen one of them, but it's pretty, I mean, we're used to seeing the hard roasted bean. But these are green, soft beans. Then you have the choices for roasting. And when I go into, I kind of like the taste of the light roast better. So I'll get a light roast coffee and I'll buy light roast coffee and make that at home.
More caffeine.
And there we go. So it has more caffeine. Anybody know why? Why does the light roast coffee have more caffeine? And the answer
Maybe because it's not as strong? I don't know.
well, the answer is that with the darker roasts, you're roasting the beans longer. So basically, you're taking all sorts of stuff out of the beans, become more porous over time when exposed to the heat. So some of the chemicals and the natural biochemicals in there excrete during that process. So basically, it's just because it's not roasted as long that the light roast has more caffeine. And if you drink it and are sensitive to caffeine, you can really feel it. It's probably about a 50 milligram difference between a light roast and a dark roast. So, yeah. And the other ways to drink it, so yeah,
That's why espresso is good for you.
that's why espresso.
Yeah.
And it's,
I have a small plant that makes 3 cups of espresso. I have that every morning. Delicious.
nice.
Yeah.
And you have a machine that makes it?
No, put it on the stove.
Oh, okay. Of an espresso grind, you mean, a roast that you use? Okay.
Italiadoro.
Okay. So you can get an espresso grind, and at the same time, there's an espresso process to get the traditional espresso that you really sort of require a machine to do, the way it's infused. But there are a lot of different ways to drink it. One of the things that's the snazzy new thing now that young folks are excited about is cold brew. Have you heard of this?
Yeah,
Cold
my
brew
wife
coffee?
likes it, my daughter likes it.
And anybody know what that is? No?
I'm paying attention.
The cold seems like you're paying attention. The cold brew is something where you take the coffee grinds and then at room temperature or in the refrigerator, you let it steep for a day or 2. So it ends up having a different flavor, really, and it also ends up having a high caffeine content. And they even have something called a nitro brew. You can see nitro cold brew coffee. And what that is nitrogen is injected to create the foam for the cold brew. So, like many of these things, you know, it's really, I'm reminded that you can do almost, as I looked at this stuff online, you can do almost anything.
Does nitro have more caffeine in it also?
What's that?
Does the nitro brew have more caffeine in it?
It
also?
does have more caffeine because it's exposed to the grounds for so
What is
long.
this stuff they call turbo shots? You get at the coffee.
I'm not
Like
sure. I've
Dunkin'
never
Donuts,
never
they call
heard of it.
turbos.
It might just be a marketing.
I think that gives it more caffeine also, if I'm not mistaken.
Huh.
You can get it like at, I don't know if you still can get it, but you used to get it like at Dunkin' Donuts. It's you get turbo shots. It probably gives you more caffeine. I don't know. I never get it. But
Don't ever drink
I don't
coffee
need it.
from Dunkin' Donuts, you know. That's not coffee.
I like it.
God.
You like strong coffee. I don't like strong. That's why I don't go to
Well, make
Starbucks.
strong coffee.
That's why I don't go to Starbucks.
All you have to do is go to your kitchen, you can make it as strong as you want.
I don't make it strong.
Yeah.
My wife said I don't make it strong enough.
And people, I don't know, I haven't gotten into this stuff too deeply, but the ways, are people interested where the food comes from that they get and what it takes to get here or not?
Yeah.
I mean, there are relative degrees of interest. Some people aren't interested at all, but there's a fair amount of slavery that's involved with the cultivation of the coffee that we drink, including child slavery. And so there are companies now that are gradually paying attention to those things, including Dunkin' Donuts. You mentioned Dunkin' Donuts. I think they're saying by 2025, all of their coffee will be fair traded. So in other words, a lot of these big companies, a lot of the biggest companies can get coffee from multiple sources, and they pull all of that coffee together, as opposed to people that are real connoisseurs. They're looking for single source. So they're looking for beans from one place. That's the luxury you have if you make your coffee at home. If you make your coffee at home, you can decide exactly, you can get beans from one place and you can have a distinct taste. If you're getting coffee at Dunkin' Donuts, I mean, you're probably in a single cup getting beans from, I don't know how many places, a ton
I
of,
don't know.
yeah, you don't know, a ton of different places.
Wherever it's cheapest.
Yeah, exactly.
I get coffee from Dunkin' Donuts one day a week, that's it.
What,
And on Friday, when I go to Fall River, we get the free 1 cup of coffee, and then the rest of the week, I don't drink Dunkin' Donuts coffee. Unless somebody decides to buy me one or go to Honeydew and get me a coffee over there. Other than that,
and people know where it came from, right? Dunkin' Donuts, where it was born.
Canton.
Oh,
Actually,
I thought it was Quincy.
Quincy.
What?
Well, it's
Quincy had the first Dunkin' Donuts, I know that.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
Quincy in Southern Artery. 'Cause
there's corporate offices were in Randolph at one time too.
Mm-hmm.
My wife gets her coffee at Cumberland Farms.
Oh, yeah.
$1.05.
I know a lot of folks that love the Cumberland
I
Farms.
get it at Wayne's
Cheap.
senior rate, you get it for free.
How about you? Where do you get yours?
I don't drink.
You don't drink. You don't drink the coffee.
No.
And you, sir?
Cumberland Wendy's, or home.
Cumberland, Wendy's, or home?
I started trying to drink it one time when I was younger, and I just got such awful indigestion. Every time I did, I stopped.
Oh, wow.
And you need Pepto-Bismol.
I mean, they also say one of the other health benefits alleged is help with weight, and they say it's a great tool to avoid type 2 diabetes. And one of the reasons for that might be, again, because the caffeine sort of compels you to move around a little bit. Lights a fire under you.
Oh, yeah.
Lotion.
The other way to look at it too is that no matter how much you pay for a package of coffee in a supermarket or wherever you buy it, okay? No matter how much you pay, it's still per cup far, far cheaper than anything Dunkin'
Oh, yeah,
Donuts
definitely.
sells.
Oh, yeah.
Unless you get it free from Dunkin' Donuts, which I do.
It's not worth drinking.
I mean, it's so true.
That's true.
That's the benefit of making it at home, as most of you could probably conclude, or maybe you know exactly yourselves. I mean, you could probably pick the best coffee around, to your point. And if you make it at home, you're still going to be spending far less money than
definitely.
even if you go to Cumberland Farms. Probably you'll be able to make it a lot cheaper. What other questions do you guys have about coffee or curiosities?
No, I can remember when we were growing, you probably remember back when we were growing up, we had the A&Ps.
Yeah.
And I believe Stop and Shop, we used to get the ground coffee, A&P, that was the 8 o'clock coffee. My mother used to get that, and that was very cheap at the time. It's probably not cheap today. I don't even know if they still do the ground coffee at the supermarkets. But it was very cheap, and it was like the best coffee in the world. It was great. It was already ground up in the
Right.
bag.
My
The-
father always bought Oka.
What's that?
Oka coffee.
Oka?
Yeah,
Never heard of it.
yeah, at the AMP, they don't own the
Oh,
Well,
store.
okay.
I only remember the
Yeah,
8 o'clock one.
yeah, there were three of them
Okay.
at the AMP. Oka.
That was like the best cup of coffee. I'm telling you.
Another
It
one
was
that
very
came in a
cheap.
yellow package.
I believe that was like their cheap brand too. Was the 8 o'clock coffee.
I remember that in the AMP too, there was like that red metal,
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Grind
Grind
it,
it,
yeah.
grind
the
it.
grinder,
Grind- yeah.
Ground it fresh.
right?
Yeah.
So the fresh grind, for people that really love it, they're always talking about freshness. And if you buy ground coffee in a bag, one of the first hints they say is don't put it in the refrigerator. You don't want to do that because it'll pick up other smells or release its own. But they're
Put in the freezer.
what's that? Freezer?
Yeah.
Oh, I've heard more than one person say they put it in the freezer to hold on to it. But a fresh grind is usually what they want. And for something like espresso, we talked about espresso earlier, that whole culture fascinates me. Once I started looking into it, what they do for a grind is they always try and match the grind. So if you go into a fancy coffee shop and you get an espresso, what they're doing is they're grinding the espresso every hour or so. It's not like to make espresso you have a bunch of ground espresso coffee at the start of the day and you use it. They keep adjusting the grind, and if the coffee is a little bit too bitter or it's a little bit too anything one way or another, what they adjust is the grind. The next time that they make it, they adjust the
Almost
grind.
like talcum powder.
It's a-
So fine.
What's sacrosanct is the time. So the time that they do it, which is like 20 some odd seconds for the process where they force the water through it, that doesn't change. So the barista doesn't adjust that. I'm going to do it a little longer or a little less because the grind is a little this or that. That remains the same. What they do is they grind it differently the next time around, which is kind of interesting.
Now, I worked at the shipyard back in the 60s and 70s, and we used to go to one of the places before we go to work and get coffee. And they had the best tasting coffee, it was great. And I'm like, what kind of coffee? La Touraine, remember La Touraine coffee?
I don't.
It was La Touraine, you could buy it in the super, it was the best cup of coffee, I'm telling you, if I can remember correctly, La Touraine was a very cheap coffee, it didn't cost you much.
Mm-hmm.
But they made the best coffee, I'm telling
That's
you.
why they went out of business, yeah.
Anything else? Is there anything else you're curious about? Yes.
Why don't they put ingredients on the bags or the cans and the caffeine amount?
Do they, you're asking? Or?
I say, why don't they?
Oh, well, why don't they?
Yeah.
I suppose that the caffeine amount would be. I mean, I don't know the answer to that,
Okay.
but probably one of the reasons is that the caffeine amount is going to depend on how much. I mean, right off the bat, one of the biggest things that affects the taste and the caffeine content of your coffee is how much coffee you decide to put in to make your cup or your pot.
I see
And
that,
since
yeah.
there's not a standard serving,
Okay.
But if anybody's really, really interested in coffee and really likes coffee, try the pour over, okay? Okay. The only place I can think of offhand to get it is at Melita Coffee,
Yep.
okay? Because they sell everything. Just take a 10-ounce mug, put the holder on top of the mug, okay?
and the filter.
And the filter you can buy at any supermarket, like 200 for $1 or $2 or whatever it is, okay? And just use 1 tablespoon of coffee. Whatever coffee you like, just use a tablespoon and see what it tastes like, okay? If you don't like it or you think it's too weak, then put a little bit more the next time. And a little bit more, and a little bit more, until you get the one that you say, wow, this is really good. And that's when you stop. But you keep adjusting it.
Right.
There's no reason not to.
I agree completely. Half the coffee that I've drunk in the last 10 years is exactly what this gentleman just described. So it's a pour over. So first of all, you don't need, there is no, beyond boiling the water, you don't need any kind of appliance or electricity. You got to boil the water first. But once the water is boiled, you're just taking ground coffee that's in a filter over, you put the filter and the contraption to hold the filter right over a coffee cup. And then you just pour 8 ounces, 10 ounces of hot water over the grounds and you get your cup of coffee.
So it's similar to like the K-cups. It's similar to that.
Well, it's dissimilar to
Similar
that
process.
in that the K cups is kind of the counterpoint to this. So
Yeah.
the K cup is this whole appliance, a machine,
Right.
where you have a plastic container that has a fixed number of grounds. You put it in the machine, you turn it down, and the machine is filled with water. And you press a button, and it punctures your K cup, and the water goes through the coffee grounds and gives you a cup.
But it's the
You
same
drink a cup-
process
You're
though.
drinking a cup of coffee that somebody else made for you,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah.
I'm saying
And,
it's the same process, what you're saying is with the K-cup. Same process, the water goes into the,
yeah. The water goes in.
it's the same process.
And people love the K-cups. You mentioned Dave. Dave is a K-cup addict. Dave loves the K-cups, and people love the K-cups who are really busy and they don't want to spend the time, and maybe they don't appreciate the distinction for taste, because then they can just keep, the cardboard box full of K-cups, stick it in the machine, press a
Or if
button.
somebody who doesn't drink 1 or 2 cups a day, that doesn't want to make a whole pot, the K-cups are good for them too.
Sure. Yeah. Yes.
Do you put boiling water in over it, or
No,
do you
don't
let the
boil-
water sit
Don't boil
after
the
it's
water.
boiled?
Don't boil it.
Yeah. The ideal temperature is something around. I mean, what's the boiling water? The boiling water is, what is it? 212.
Something like that,
And they say that the ideal temperature for most coffees and most grinds is probably like around 205 or something.
So
So,
the same general area.
so if you're making your coffee, some people just when it starts to look like it's about to boil, they take it off and pour it. Others, and if you haven't kept an eye on it and it's bubbling and it's boiling, then you just wait, take it off the heat and wait maybe 30 seconds, and then pour it over. But you apparently don't want to put the boiling water over it because it's a little too hot.
These small electrical
Right.
appliances that will heat the water up for you.
Yeah, that's what my ex-partner has, that she used this morning. She had it's like a glass carafe that is, maybe it's a half gallon, and she just fills that up with tap water and then puts it on an electrical, it's like a mini hot plate just to hold the carafe, and
You
it
go to
boils the water.
supermarket, buy distilled water,
Right. Oh, distilled water, sure.
okay?
Yeah.
$1 a gallon.
When he mentioned the percolator earlier, my grandmother had, when we were growing up, we had the percolator coffee.
Yeah.
Well, we didn't have Mr. Coffees back then and stuff. And we would make a pot of coffee. And you know how hot the coffee is once you perk it? It's like really, really hot. My grandma, I don't know how she did it, she would take a cup of coffee right after it's made and down it. I'm like,
Oh, wow.
what are you, nuts? I would have burned my insides out. Some people can do it, I don't know how they do it, but I would have burned my insides out, believe me.
I'm trying to think with my grandmother, who I mentioned at the outset here, they retired, my grandparents did, to southern New Jersey, and I would go down and visit them as a kid in the summers. And again, at that point, she was a reformed alcoholic, and she was obsessed with words. She was always doing crossword puzzles. She was also involved with town politics and things like that. But the coffee obsession with her was so great that she had my grandfather was driving to a town like 50 miles away a couple times a month to buy coffee soda, because she also, one of the other things that she would drink if it wasn't coffee, she liked the coffee soda. So, I mean, some people love it in a way that it's hard to even be believed. Yes.
Could it be considered an addiction?
Yeah.
Could it be considered an addiction? I mean, in response to that, I would say a couple things. I mean, some folks say that anything could be an addiction, right? If you're behaving in some compulsory manner where it feels like you're really not making the decision, but your body is making it for you, it could be anything that you could be addicted to. One could argue you could be addicted to helping people, for example, although that might be a beneficent addiction. But can caffeine be an addiction? Is it an addiction? I would say technically yes.
Yeah, I think it is.
I don't know. What do you guys think?
I think it is.
Yeah.
Colombian starter food in the morning.
Well, that's the thing. Can you imagine coming down from the bedroom, going into the kitchen, and finding out there is no coffee? I can't imagine anything worse than that.
Did you have the shakes that day, Bob? Do you have the shakes?
I would never get to that point.
Yeah, well.
I would
You know,
never
you
get to the
mentioned
point
coffee
where...
soda. I grew up in North Weymouth. You know where West Augusta Beach was?
Yeah.
Like over the hill from West Augusta Beach, you know where the yacht club is?
Yes.
Okay, over the hill in the, what they call the Johnson Beach, which had the rock, we call it the Rocky Beach. You had to put your shoes on in the water. And we had a store down the end of our street. The reason we called it Johnson Beach because the guy who owned the store, his name was Al Johnson. And he had a Simpson Springs soda. My grandfather would go and buy coffee soda, chocolate soda, and stuff they don't make anymore. Simpson Springs, but most people you can't buy in the supermarket. I mean, he'd come home with coffee soda, chocolate soda, and stuff.
I mean, it's interesting to see. I mean, I wonder if, as time goes by here, given that things are changing, if you're obviously seeing more folks, more small businesses that are importing, that are buying their own beans and roasting them.
There's hundreds of different kinds of coffee out there.
So,
Yeah.
Hundreds of, literally hundreds of brands.
So does anybody know the what? I mean, the biggest city in the United States for coffee drinking is San Francisco. The biggest state is New York. But for what's happening more and more is that the number of coffee shops and the number of well, maybe not the shops any longer, but the roasters are proliferating. So as we get more of these roasters, I mean, I'm trying to figure out ways to support some of these small businesses because I feel if I'm not making it at home, or even if I'm making it at home and I'm buying coffee from a large producer, but particularly if I'm going out to Dunkin' Donuts, then I'm taking my money and that profit's going, I don't know where it's going. So it's nice if somebody local is making the effort to buy the beans and roast it, and you can support them.
Company I used to work for about 1,000 years ago sent me to Burlington, Vermont for a week. And one night my wife and I went in the restaurant, had dinner, and obviously had coffee afterwards. I took one sip of the coffee and I said, wow, this is really, really good. This is really, really good coffee. So, waitress, what kind of coffee is this? I don't know, but I'll find out for you. Came back, Green Mountain.
Oh, wow.
I thought you were going to say put
believe
maple
it.
syrup in it or something.
The regular house brand of Green Mountain.
Green Mountain does
I
make
think
good
they call it
coffee.
House Blend or something like that.
My sister used to like
Right.
the New England coffee also.
There's
Those are all
literally
good.
Hundreds and
They
hundreds.
Oh,
were
yeah.
fair trade.
You could try a different one
They
every
support the
time you
I
farm.
thought
go.
you were going to say
Fair
they put
trade.
maple syrup in the
Green Mountain does, I believe so, yeah. I mean, all the major producers, now they have to at least nominally support it, but it looks like they all claim to be moving in that direction. I mean, if you look at it realistically, it's kind of a hard thing to manage because there are so many individual growers. The whole idea of enforcement of some kind of ethical standard for the beans is pretty difficult to do if you're not buying beans from one source. So if that is a concern of yours and that's something that you think is worth thinking about, the single origin thing is really the only way to accomplish that and know that you have, because you know you're buying from a grower. Then you can find out what are the labor practices that grower uses. You know, other
Is there any statistical data on who consumes more, men or women?
I'm trying to think if at one point I'm not sure. I know I have some statistical data on who consumes more country-wise, but I don't know the men or women one. That's interesting.
I guess it'd be pretty much 50-50, kind of.
My guess, but I don't know. But do people know
Women probably drink tea.
more women tea? Maybe.
Probably.
What about
Just a guess.
What about countries? I mean, the United States, given our size and our wealth, we definitely import the most coffee. But in terms of per capita, what country do you think drinks the most coffee? Let's
always
say,
have to say South America.
let's say what 3 countries drink the most coffee?
South America.
What are the
that's
3 at the
one,
top of the list?
'cause that's where it
Nope.
originated, no? Oh.
Mediterranean countries,
Nope,
no?
Germany?
Vietnam?
nope, nope,
Scandinavia.
nope. Come on, you guys got to.
Switzerland?
Scandinavia is close. Well, part of it is Scandinavia,
Yeah.
yeah.
Switzerland?
This pour-over technique, I've seen it with a glass carafe that was shaped like a pair of triangles.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's Danish, as I recall. Had a
Uh,
leather
Yeah.
binder around it so you could grab it
Exactly.
without burning yourself.
Did anybody
Pour
say
from it.
United States?
That's a great appliance. That glass carafe for the pour over is the one also that I've used as well. It's good.
They sell those
So,
in
so the
supermarket.
countries, the answer to the question is the
Finland.
people that drunk Finland.
Yeah.
That is the answer. So Finland is number 1, and 2 and 3 are Norway and Iceland. So if you think about it, it sort of makes the most sense that the places that are coldest,
Yeah.
darkest,
Oh, yeah.
I mean, those are the places where they're going to tend to drink the most coffee. Who drinks the least coffee? Which countries? Who drinks the least? Oh, what you just said is the clue. What did you just say?
I said somebody that drinks tea.
There you go. So
England?
that's the clue.
England?
The top 3, no, it's not England, but it's India, Pakistan, and Nepal. India, Pakistan, and Nepal.
I know a lot of,
Don't-
England is very famous for tea drinkers, I know that.
It is.
Japan.
I lived there for a little while and drank a fair amount of it. But so if you have a trip planned to Nepal, maybe you want to bring coffee with you.
I haven't been planning on going there lately.
Oh, okay. Well,
I don't even know where it is.
What's
Japan
the other
wasn't on
two
this.
besides Finland?
what's that?
Japan wasn't on the list of tea drinkers?
Japan on the list for which?
Tea drinkers.
Tea drinkers.
For tea drinkers. Oh, I don't know. I didn't look at the list for tea drinkers. Yes.
What's the other two besides Finland?
The other 2 besides Finland are Norway and Iceland.
Oh, okay,
These are the
I guess you said that, but I didn't.
these are the per capita most popular countries for drinking coffee.
I just knew that because I'm half Finnish, you know.
Oh, you are? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
There you
When I
go.
was a kid, even growing up, and they drink coffee all day long again.
It makes sense.
So when they stop drinking coffee, are they Finnish?
Yeah.
Oh!
Oh, that one hurt.
That was
That
bad.
hurt.
That was
That
bad.
hurt.
Only you would think that's funny.
I'm not, you didn't record that, right?
Of course.
Anything else? Anybody got another coffee question or curiosity?
Why don't they put where it's grown in the packages?
Well, I mean, in any of the single origin coffees, you'll see that. Not only will you see that, you'll probably see an explanation of the place, but it's the same reason why you don't see where your chocolate comes from if you get your chocolate in a Hershey bar.
Yep.
It's because they buy from,
I see.
you know, not only different farmers in one country, but different countries. And they do it in such volume that they mix it all together. So there is no single origin to identify.
So it doesn't necessarily come from Hershey, Pennsylvania.
For Hershey chocolate.
Correct.
Oh,
No.
Right.
No, it doesn't.
Right.
Now, I'll tell you, there's a coffee place, I don't know if it's still over there in South Boston, Victor's, remember Victor's Coffee?
No.
There was a,
Yeah.
yeah, they used to make it over, and I'll tell you, you go down the street, I'm trying to think what street it was on, the main street, I think it was on Summer Street maybe, and you go down there, you can actually smell the coffee while you're going down the road, it's like, greatest smell in the world, it's great.
Yeah, well,
I believe the restaurants used to serve that a lot of the restaurants used to serve the Victor's Coffee.
nice.
Anybody wants to try various coffees, buy it in a bag, buy the sack of coffee, don't buy it in a can.
That's a good.
The cans aren't made out of metal anymore anyways.
That's good advice as well.
My
Yeah.
wife gets coffee a lot of times on, like through Amazon, and she'll get I don't know who does it. She'll get like different flavors. Like we get right now, we're drinking blueberry coffee. It's blueberry flavored.
Yeah.
There's cherry flavored. There's
But
different.
Well, the
You never know
flavor
how old it is.
It tastes good though.
coffee and chocolate, which are sort of strange cousins in that they
Yeah.
both have the caffeine. Not
Right.
many plants do, but they're both unique in that you can grow other plants, like you mentioned blueberries. You can grow other plants with either the coca plant or the coffee plant, and some of that flavor will be imparted to the bean. So you can actually get pre-roasted beans that carry a little flavor of another plant. You don't necessarily have to flavor it
Speaking of
afterwards.
coffee and chocolate, I do like the Dunkaccino or the,
Dunkaccino.
they get that at Dunkin' Donuts, and I think Honeydew has what they call Mocha Madness. It's got the chocolate and the coffee mixed.
Oh, nice.
Not a bad taste.
Yeah, you
I'm
mentioned
drinking real coffee.
It probably doesn't taste,
mocha, so the first
Yeah.
place, but I'll just bring it to a close by saying when I mentioned the first place that drank coffee like we do was in Yemen. So the big port in Yemen on the south side is Mocha, Mokka.
Right, okay.
So that's where that came from,
Right.
and it came from because the beans that they got, which were either probably Ethiopian beans that are brought over the Red Sea, had a chocolatey taste to them. So we still have, that's why you still have that mocha phrase today. Yeah. Well, I think we'll wrap up. I really enjoyed things. Thanks for your time, everybody,
you know,
and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.